Hey guys, it's Lee. In this video, we're going to talk about whether or not the Sony A6400 is still worth buying in 2023. Now, when it comes down to it, there are many options from Sony this year, and you're probably wondering, is getting the Sony A6400 still a great option? Is it still a great camera? And I feel like I know the answer to that question, but let's dive a little deeper in this video so you can decide for yourself. Now, if you're new here, my name is Lee. On this channel, discuss photography gear, and anything related to that. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, definitely hit the subscribe button for more videos just like this one. And of course, hit that notification bell. Now, back to the A6400. This camera launched in 2019, so roughly 4 years ago or so. And since then, we've actually had a number of cameras from Sony. Certainly on the full frame front, we've had a lot of options, but also on the aps-c side as well. So for instance, we've seen the A6600, the A6100, the Sony ZV-E10, the Sony ZV-E1, just to name a few. Now, I've owned this camera for over 2 years at this point, and I feel like I have a really good idea of how far I can push this camera, what it's great at, what it's not so great at, and who it's going to be good for overall. You might be actually considering this for one of your first cameras that you're going to go ahead and invest in. And so let's kind of go down some of the features and some of the design aspects of this camera so you can make that decision for yourself instead of me just telling you that it's actually an awesome camera. So when we think about the design of this camera, one of the great things off the bat that I love about this camera is that it's lightweight, it's compact, and you can literally just take it just about anywhere, and you can be as obscure or unobtrusive as you like to be, or as in your face as you want to be, depending on the lenses that you choose to actually pair this camera with. And it's really great when it comes down to someone who's considering this as their first camera, like I said earlier, because there's just a lot of options that you have when it comes down to this, when it comes down to lens options, when it comes down to being able to learn, the exposure triangle and all those different aspects that are really important to photography. You can definitely do all of those things with this camera as well. And I really like the flip up screen as well. And as you can see, this is kind of how it looks. The only flaw with this one is that if you want to put something on the hot shoe, on this camera, which is going to be up here, and you actually have this flippy screen up, one of the things you're going to run into is obviously it's going to block the screen. You're not going to be able to see yourself if you're trying to shoot yourself like this. Now, there are some attachments that you can actually purchase that make that basically a non-issue. And so I'll leave some of those in the description below, but it really isn't a big problem. And if you don't use the hot shoe a lot, it's not going to be a problem at all for you. Now let's move on to the video capabilities of this camera. Now, even by today's standards, you still get some really great features when it comes down to this camera. You're getting 4K video capabilities up to 30 frames per second, as well as some 1080p options up to 120 frames per second as well, which is phenomenal. And when it does come down to the video capabilities, this is actually something that I use all the time for video. I use it for YouTube all the time. If that's what you want to use this camera for, I'm going to tell you right now, it's a great option to use, especially if you're using it more on a stationary front. Now, because this body does not have image stabilization, that might be something you might want to consider if you are actually looking to vlog and sort of walk around with this camera. Things might be a little bit more on the shaky side. Of course, you can fix that in post, but it's something to actually consider if you're looking at another camera as well and you're comparing it with the A6400. Now, when it comes down to the photo capabilities of the A6400, this camera is pretty good. It actually has a 24 megapixel aps-c CMOS sensor, and it has a Bionic X processor. So when you're shooting, you don't have to worry about it lagging or being slow or anything like that. Really, I've never had any problems with this camera. This camera really can keep up with a full day of shooting or even a professional shoot as well. One of the other great things about this is that you can also shoot uncompressed RAW. You get 425 focus points, and when it comes down to ISO, because everyone knows that's a huge thing, ISO, everyone loves to talk about it. But when it comes down to ISO, you get a range from 100 up to 3200, and it actually expands to just over 100,000 as well. So you have a lot of options in terms of how far you can actually push this when it comes down to low light and things like that. But one of the other features that really takes the cake for me when it comes down to this camera is really the eye autofocus and also the face detection autofocus that it has as well. One of the other things I forgot to mention when it comes down to photo capabilities is that you can actually shoot up to 11 frames per second if you need to shoot off any quick burst as well. So that's also another plus. And that's going to be great, of course, if you need to capture any fast moving people or objects. So if you're shooting sports or wildlife, this is going to be a great camera for that. And then also if you happen to shoot any portraits where you like to capture a lot of movement in the photographs, this is also going to be a great camera as well, because it's going to be able to move quickly enough to capture those sort of quick moving moments with that burst mode. Which is more than enough. Now, it's really funny because when I think back to my first camera, which was a Canon Rebel T3i, years and years ago, this camera runs circles around that, and obviously it should because it's a newer camera. But when I think about the capabilities of this camera versus where I started, this camera is just really just kind of like blows me away. When you consider the photo and video specs, this camera is great. Let's move on to something else, because this is something that I think is also another important feature, or something else that's important when it comes down to Sony cameras, and that's the lenses. So you have so many different options when it comes down to this camera. You have the ability to use any Sony lenses. You can also use Tamron or Sigma or Samyang, and there's a ton of other makers out there when it comes down to lenses. My personal favorite third-party lenses maker is going to be Sigma, and I actually use a lot of Sigma lenses versus Sony. Of course, I have some Sony lenses as well, but when it comes down to this camera, one of my favorite lenses right now when capturing video is a 16mm 1.4 DCDN lens by Sigma. It's a great lens. It's the perfect focal length, and it really is kind of the equivalent to like a 24mm lens if you're comparing it against full frame. So at this point, you're probably wondering, is this camera worth it in 2023? And my answer is absolutely. Why do I say absolutely? Well, because you're getting a lot of features packed into this camera, and it's really not that expensive. And you also have access to a lot of lenses. So if you're starting out and you want to sort of start to build your kit, you can definitely do that. If you want to start off with aps-c lenses and then move on to full frame lenses because you're going to upgrade to a full frame body at a later date, this is definitely the perfect camera that you can do that with, and you can still capture some really beautiful shots with it and not have to worry too much about the fact that is this lens going to be compatible, etc. You can definitely use full frame lenses on this camera and aps-c as well. One of the other things as well is if you don't ever want to sort of move on to full frame, or you want this to be sort of a travel camera or something like that, this is a great camera for that as well. A lot of the lenses that you can get for this camera are nice and small and compact, and so you can keep your kit very, very small and lightweight, so that you can just really slip it into a bag when you're traveling, or if you're out and about and just want to capture a few things, you can definitely do that. Also, when it comes down to video, this takes a really great video as well. You have access to S-Log as well. So if you really want to get into the sort of color grading and sort of go down that avenue before you start to upgrade or really get into video, this camera is great for that. So this camera really gives you a lot of different options when it comes down to getting into photography or getting into videography. There's just a lot of options. And when you compare this camera against some of the other newer bodies out here, a lot of those in my mind are pretty much just the A6400 and maybe a different body. And some of those newer bodies are actually, they feel a little bit cheaper or more a little bit plasticky a little bit as well. And so when if you want something that feels solid, that's gonna last, that's gonna take great photos, this is really a great option. And you don't have to break the piggy bank when it comes down to it as well. So definitely, this is a great camera. Now, my opinion might be a little bit different from yours, or maybe you have some other things that you love about the A6400. If that's the case, go ahead and leave a comment below. I definitely would love to hear from you. I'm sure everyone else would as well. So go ahead and do that. If you have not already and this video was helpful to you, go ahead and hit the like button as well. That really does help out this channel. Obviously, this is a newer channel. I'm trying to grow it. So go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't, of course, hit the subscribe button. Go ahead and do that for me as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.